Maybe every day you are giving away exactly what you ask God to restore to you at night. Your peace, your focus, your energy, your ability to listen to your own conscience. And the most dangerous part is that you probably don't even realize when it happens. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens when you wake up and, before you even organize your thoughts, you allow dozens of voices into your mind. It happens when someone says something about you and you feel an almost physical need to respond, when you share your plans too soon, when you explain decisions that never needed an explanation, when you seek approval before asking yourself whether what you're doing is truly aligned with what you believe. And there is a reason why this is leaving so many people mentally exhausted. But there is also an ancient and deeply spiritual principle capable of breaking this cycle. The curious thing is that it seems small, maybe too small, but stay with me, because before fully revealing this principle, we need to recognize something almost no one notices. Not everything that receives your attention deserves access to your inner life. Maybe you've felt this before. You finish an apparently ordinary day without having made any major physical effort, yet you're exhausted. Your mind feels like it has been running all day long. You answered messages, you saw the news, you listened to problems, you thought about what people said about you, you tried to predict what might happen tomorrow, you replayed a conversation from yesterday, you opened your phone for a few minutes, and before you knew it, you were absorbing the lives, opinions, achievements, and worries of dozens of other people. Your body was in one place, but your mind was everywhere else. And then night comes. You want peace. Maybe you pray. Maybe you open the Bible. Maybe you simply stare at the ceiling thinking, why can't my mind stop? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question is, how many things did you allow into it today? Today, we're going to explore 5 changes that happen when you stop giving your attention away to the world, learn the power of silence, and refocus your life on what you can actually control, while trusting God with what you cannot. And the 5th change is probably the most important, because it is there that we discover why some people remain anxious even while trying to control every detail of their own lives. There is something Stoicism explains extraordinarily well about this, but there is a part that Stoicism alone cannot complete, and that is precisely where faith changes everything. Before we continue, I want to ask you a question. How many times have you lost your peace trying to explain something to someone who had already decided not to understand you? Think about that. Because maybe you're spending an enormous amount of energy trying to control places where you never had control in the first place. Marcus Aurelius knew this conflict. He ruled an empire surrounded by wars, political instability, loss, and people trying to influence his decisions. And yet, one of the ideas that repeatedly appears in his reflections is the need to return inward. Not because the outside world didn't matter, but because he knew that if the outside world ruled his inner world, then even an emperor could become a slave. Epictetus understood this in an even more brutal way. He literally experienced slavery. And yet he built his philosophy around an extraordinarily simple distinction. There are things that depend on us and things that do not. Your opinion, you can work on it. Your response, yours. Your discipline, your responsibility. But other people's opinions, the past, someone else's reaction, the perfect outcome? No. And this is where the first change begins. You stop reacting to everything that touches your emotions. Notice how it normally works. Someone criticizes you. Immediately, your mind prepares a defense. Someone takes too long to respond. Your mind invents a story. Something doesn't go according to plan. You begin imagining everything that could go wrong. You're not just experiencing events, you're adding interpretations to them. And often it is the interpretation, not the event, that steals your peace. That is why silence is much more powerful than simply staying quiet. Silence is creating space between what happened and what you will do with what happened. Seneca understood this when he advocated delaying our reaction as a remedy for anger. Modern psychology describes something similar when it talks about emotional regulation. When we create a pause before an impulsive response, we increase our ability to act deliberately instead of simply obeying the emotion. But there is an even deeper spiritual dimension. The Bible says in James, "Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." Notice that. It is not a command not to feel. It is a call not to allow what you feel in that moment to automatically determine what you will do. And maybe that is exactly where you are losing part of your strength. You feel and respond, feel and explain, feel and post, feel and confront, feel and decide. But some decisions that could have been wise died because you couldn't endure a few minutes of silence. And here is something almost no one teaches us. Not every emotion needs to become an action. Not every provocation deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every opinion deserves space inside your head. Not every thought needs to be believed, and not every plan needs to be announced. That last part is especially important because it leads us to the second change. You learn to protect what is still growing. Imagine a seed that has just been planted in the soil. You don't dig it up every morning to show people that it's growing. You don't need to prove that there is a tree there. You protect it, water it, and let the growth happen where no one is watching. But we do exactly the opposite with our plans. We have an idea and tell people about it. We make a decision and announce it. We start something and seek approval. We want to emotionally receive the reward of a transformation we haven't even built yet. And then something strange happens. The energy fades, the discipline weakens, and what seemed so important slowly disappears. So during this video, I want you to consider an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe you don't need more motivation. Maybe you need to stop wasting the energy you already have. But there was an even deeper layer to this. Because protecting your attention and learning to remain silent can give you back an enormous amount of control over your mind. But there is a danger. You can learn all of these things and still make a silent mistake. You can turn self-control into an attempt to control absolutely everything. And when that happens, Stoicism leaves us with an extraordinarily important question. What do we do with what truly isn't in our hands? This is where our story begins. Because once someone believed he had finally learned to control his own life. He stopped arguing, stopped telling people his plans, started protecting his mornings, stepped away from the noise. It seemed like he was doing everything right, until he received news that no amount of discipline could change. And in that moment, he discovered that there is a massive difference between controlling yourself and trying to take God's place. That difference completely changed the way he saw silence, control, and faith, and it can change yours too. He believed he was finally learning to control his own life. For months, Daniel had been trying to do something he had almost never been able to do before: reduce the noise. He stopped starting his mornings by looking at his phone. He stopped telling his friends about every new plan. When someone provoked him at work, he took a breath before responding. He began to notice that many arguments that once seemed absolutely necessary simply died when he refused to feed them. And little by little, something inside him began to change. Daniel was calmer, more focused, more disciplined. For the first time in many years, he felt that he wasn't merely reacting to his own life, he was leading it. But there was something he still hadn't realized. Daniel was learning to control his reactions, and quietly beginning to believe that he could control the outcomes too. That difference seems small until life puts something in front of you that your hands simply cannot change. That is what happened on an apparently ordinary Tuesday. Daniel was at work when he saw 3 missed calls from his sister. Normally, he would have finished what he was doing before calling back. But there was something strange about that sequence of calls. He called her. The voice on the other end sounded different. His father had become ill. Hours later, Daniel was sitting in a hospital chair staring at a closed door. There was no productivity technique to apply there. No morning routine could solve it. No planning. No Stoic phrase could force the doctor to walk out of that room with the answer he wanted. And that was when an old need returned, the need to control. Daniel started researching. He read about diagnoses, looked up statistics, asked the doctors questions, messaged people he knew, opened dozens of pages on his phone. His mind was trying to construct some kind of certainty in a place where no certainty was available. The less control he had, the more desperately he tried to find it. Maybe you know that feeling. It's when someone you love is suffering and you can't fix it, when a relationship ends and no explanation can make it go back to the way it was, when you're waiting for an answer that never comes, when you did everything right, and even then, the outcome was different from what you expected. In those moments, we discover a truth we normally avoid. There are situations in which suffering is not born only from what is happening. It is born from our desperate resistance to what we cannot control. Daniel understood this intellectually. He knew the Stoic distinction. He knew that Epictetus taught us to separate what depends on us from what does not. But knowing a truth when everything is fine is very different from trusting it when someone you love is behind a hospital door. He began pacing the hallway. He sat down, stood up, looked at his phone, refreshed the screen, searched again, as if some new piece of information could give him control over the situation again, until he noticed a man sitting a few chairs away. He was older. He was alone. His hands remained clasped together. His eyes were closed. Daniel watched him for a few seconds. The man wasn't sleeping. He was praying. It bothered Daniel in a way that was difficult to explain, because Daniel believed in God too. He prayed too. But in that moment, he realized he was doing something very different. He prayed while continuing to try to control everything. He asked God to take over the situation, and 5 seconds later, mentally took command again. He said, "Thy will be done." But inside he thought, "As long as it's the will I want." And that realization hit him. Maybe surrendering something to God isn't saying you surrendered it. Maybe it means stopping yourself from trying to carry what you just placed in his hands. And that was when everything began to change. Daniel put his phone away, not because researching was wrong, not because the doctors didn't matter, not because he had given up, but because he finally realized that he had reached the limit of what he could do. He had gotten his father to the hospital, spoken with the doctors, notified the family, he was present. All of that was within his responsibility. But the outcome? No. So he did something that in that moment seemed harder than taking any action. He remained silent. No researching, no imagining scenarios, no trying to predict the next hour. He simply breathed and prayed. Not a sophisticated prayer. He didn't try to find beautiful words. He simply said, "God, I can't control this. Help me not turn my fear into an attempt to take your place." Nothing outside changed immediately. The door remained closed. The doctors kept working. The future remained uncertain. But something had changed inside him. And this is the third change. You begin to distinguish responsibility from control. This distinction can free a person from years of anxiety. Responsibility asks, "What is mine to do?" Control asks, "How do I guarantee the outcome?" The first question produces action. The second often produces torment. You can care for someone. You cannot guarantee that person will never suffer. You can work with excellence. You cannot control every decision the company makes. You can love someone honestly. You cannot force them to stay. You can raise your children. You cannot live their lives for them. You can prepare for tomorrow. You cannot force tomorrow to obey your plans. Stoicism leads us to this boundary with remarkable clarity. Do what depends on you. Accept that the rest does not obey your will. But for the Christian faith, there is another step. What is not under your control does not simply have to fall into a void. It can be entrusted to God. Proverbs calls us to trust in the Lord with all our heart and not rely solely on our own understanding. That does not mean abandoning reason. It means recognizing its limits. Daniel had spent years believing that peace meant finally managing to organize every circumstance. In that hospital chair, he began to understand something completely different. Peace may not mean being certain about what will happen. Peace can mean knowing whom to trust when you don't know what will happen. But the real lesson was still to come. Hours later, the doctor finally appeared. Daniel's father was stable. He would still need follow-up care and treatment, but the worst immediate danger had passed. Daniel felt immense relief, and it might seem as though this was the great revelation of the story. It wasn't, because imagine if the news had been different. Would Daniel's prayer have failed? Would his trust have been useless? Would God only be worthy of trust when the outcome matched what Daniel wanted? That question stayed with him for days, and it eventually revealed the deepest mistake we make when we try to control life. Sometimes we don't just want to control events. We want God to confirm our plans. We want peace, but only after receiving guarantees. We want to trust, but only when we know how the story ends. We want to surrender without actually letting go. And maybe that is why you're so tired. Not necessarily because there is something wrong with your discipline. Maybe you are trying to carry two responsibilities at the same time, yours and God's. You try to control your actions and the outcomes, your behavior and other people's opinions, your effort and the future, the present and what might happen 6 months from now. No mind can carry all of that without becoming fragmented. And here we find the fourth change. Silence stops being merely the absence of words and becomes a space for discernment. When you stop responding immediately, you notice what you truly feel. When you stop telling everyone your plans, you begin to discover whether you truly want them. When you reduce the external noise, you can identify which worries require action and which require surrender. And when you become silent before God, you begin to notice something the noise constantly hides. Not every feeling of uneasiness is a call to do something. Some feelings of uneasiness are a call to trust. That is what Daniel began practicing after that day. Whenever a problem arose, he asked himself 2 questions. The first, what is in my hands? The second, what do I need to place in God's hands? If he could act, he acted. If he could apologize, he apologized. If he could work, he worked. If he needed to set a boundary, he set it. But when he reached the boundary where his influence ended, he tried not to cross it mentally. Because that was where he realized something that would change his life. The secret was not simply to focus on yourself and remain silent. That was only the beginning. There was a much deeper form of silence, a silence that is not born from coldness or pride or the attempt to appear strong. It is the silence of someone who has finally understood, I will do what is mine to do, and I will not destroy my peace trying to control what belongs to God. But the 5th change is still missing, and it is the most dangerous of all, because you can stop reacting, protect your plans, control your attention, and surrender the future to God, and still continue to be silently governed by something external, something that enters your mind before you even realize it, something that determines how you see yourself, what you want, and even what you believe you need to prove. When you identify it, you may understand why you have so often sought validation from people who could never give you the peace you were looking for. And this is precisely where Stoicism, psychology, and faith begin pointing toward the same inner battle. There is a prison that needs no bars. It works in a much quieter way. You walk into a room and notice who looked at you. You post something and check who reacted. You make a decision, and before asking whether it aligns with your values, you imagine what certain people will think. Someone praises you and your day gets better. Someone criticizes you and suddenly a single sentence occupies your mind for hours, maybe even for days. And the strangest thing is that we can call this many things: sensitivity, concern, the need for recognition. But there is an uncomfortable truth behind it. When your peace depends on someone's opinion, you have given that person an authority they may never have deserved to possess. This is the fifth change. You stop building your identity from external validation. And maybe this is where the true meaning of that secret finally begins to appear. Focusing on yourself and remaining silent does not mean becoming indifferent to people. It does not mean thinking only about yourself, much less abandoning relationships. It means stopping yourself from consulting the entire world before consulting your conscience. It means no longer turning every decision into a public election. Because think about what happens when you constantly need to be understood. You over-explain. When you need approval, you adapt too much. When you need admiration, you show too much. And when you need to prove that you are on the right path, you talk about the path instead of simply walking it. But there is something even deeper. Psychology knows our tendency to seek social approval very well. We are relational beings. Our brains pay attention to signals of acceptance and rejection because, for much of human history, belonging to a group was connected to survival. That is why criticism can feel much bigger than it rationally should. That is why rejection can physically hurt. That is why you can know that a certain person's opinion should not matter and still feel shaken by it. The problem is not wanting connection. The problem begins when belonging requires you to abandon who you are supposed to be. Epictetus repeatedly warned his students about the danger of organizing their lives around what other people think, because there is an impossible contradiction in that. You want freedom, but you hand your peace over to the opinions of people you cannot control. You want clarity, but you allow dozens of voices to participate in decisions that only you will have to live with. You want discipline, but you constantly compare your progress with people who are walking through completely different stories. And then you try to control the impression you make. This is where the battle becomes exhausting, because controlling your words is possible. Controlling your behavior is possible. But controlling what another person concludes about you, impossible. You can be kind and still be misunderstood. You can be honest and still be accused. You can act with good intentions and still disappoint someone. You can do the best you can and still receive no recognition. Marcus Aurelius knew this. Imagine governing while thousands of people have opinions about your decisions. If he tried to build peace by convincing every critic, he would never have peace. That is why Stoicism always returns to the same territory: character, virtue, intention, action. What is within your responsibility? But now we need to cross the boundary we mentioned earlier, because the Christian faith asks an even deeper question. If you stop living for people's approval, whose approval will you live for? And that question changes everything. Paul writes in Galatians, "If I were still pleasing men, I would not be a servant of Christ." This is not an invitation to despise people. It is a warning about inner authority. Because there is a difference between loving people and living enslaved to their approval. You can listen to advice without surrendering your identity. You can accept correction without allowing criticism to determine your worth. You can love someone without turning that person into the source of your peace. You can serve others without living to impress them. And here, Stoicism and faith come close, but they do not become the same thing. Stoicism says, do not surrender your mind to external judgment. Faith adds, your deepest identity does not need to be built by external judgment because it is anchored in God. Notice the difference. It is not simply, I don't care what anyone thinks. That may simply be pride disguised as strength. It is something more mature. I will listen to what can make me better. I will examine my actions. I will correct what is wrong, but I will not surrender my worth to the approval of a crowd. That is freedom, and Daniel began to understand this after that experience at the hospital. He realized that his problem was not only information overload, For years, he had shared his plans because he wanted to hear, "You can do it." He explained his decisions because he wanted to hear, "You're right." He showed his progress because he needed to feel, "We see you." And when those responses did not come, something inside him weakened. So he decided to conduct an experiment. For 30 days, he would choose one important goal and tell no one about it. He would not post about it. He would not seek praise. He would not share every small victory. He would simply do the work. During the first few days, he felt a curious restlessness. Whenever he made progress, he wanted to tell someone. Whenever he managed to follow a difficult routine, he wanted to show it. Whenever someone asked how his projects were going, he felt the urge to explain everything. But he began to notice a question hidden behind that impulse. If no one knows I'm changing, is that change still worth anything? That question confronted him, because it revealed how much of his discipline had become performance. But the real lesson was still to come. A few weeks later, Daniel realized that he was working differently, more quietly, more consistently, without needing to create a narrative about his own progress. He was not trying to look disciplined. He was practicing discipline. He was not talking about the person he wanted to become. He was becoming that person. And here we find one of the most powerful paradoxes of silence. When you stop using words to build an image, you have more energy left to build a life. But be careful. This does not mean you should never share your goals. Shared accountability can be useful. Mentors are important. Community is important. The Christian faith itself is not a journey of isolation. The problem is not speaking. The problem is discovering why you are speaking. To receive guidance or approval, to ask for help or attention, to be accountable, or to experience the feeling of achievement before you have actually achieved it. That distinction requires honesty and silence, because there are answers that only appear when you stop trying to impress even yourself. That was when Daniel began asking himself 3 questions before talking about something important. Does this need to be said? Does it need to be said now? Am I saying this to serve a purpose or to feed my ego? Those questions began changing his conversations. He spoke less impulsively, listened more, reacted less, and when he needed to speak, his words carried more intention. The old saying attributed to the Stoic tradition about having 2 ears and 1 mouth points to something simple. There is wisdom in listening more than speaking. But the Bible goes even deeper. Ecclesiastes reminds us that there is a time to keep silence and a time to speak. This is essential because the true teaching of this video was never simply stay silent. There is cowardly silence, silence used as punishment, silence in the face of injustice that demands a stand, silence that avoids necessary conversations. That is not the silence we are seeking. Wise silence does not run from the truth. It prevents the ego from speaking before wisdom does. That is why Jesus also gives us an extraordinarily powerful image. The Gospels show moments when he responds, moments when he confronts, moments when he teaches, and moments when he remains silent. He did not need to respond to every provocation in order to know who he was. Think about that. Maybe part of your exhaustion comes precisely from trying to respond to battles that were never yours. Maybe you are defending your image before people who have already decided how they see you. Maybe you are trying to prove your worth to someone who will never have the authority to define it. Maybe you are following so many other people's lives that you can no longer hear the direction of your own. And now we arrive at the point where everything connects. The 5 changes are not 5 separate tricks. They form a single discipline. You stop reacting to everything. You protect what is still growing. You distinguish responsibility from control. You turn silence into discernment, and you stop depending on external validation to know who you are. The result? Your attention begins to come home. Your energy stops leaking away. Your mind becomes less fragmented, and your faith stops being merely an attempt to ask God to control circumstances. It begins to become trust. Stoicism teaches you to ask, what depends on me? Faith teaches you to ask, what do I need to entrust to God? One question protects your responsibility, the other protects your peace. But understanding this is still not transformation. You can finish this video agreeing with everything, and tomorrow, wake up, grab your phone, step back into the noise, respond to the first provocation, seek approval, and repeat exactly the same pattern. That is why the final step is the most important. We need to turn this understanding into behavior. In the next block, you will have a simple method you can start using today. 3 actions. Without having to disappear from the world, without abandoning your responsibilities, without pretending that nothing affects you. And at the end, I want to ask you a question that may be uncomfortable, not about what other people have done to you, but about what you have allowed to continue happening inside you, because maybe, after that question, you will realize that the greatest distraction in your life was never your phone, social media, or other people. Maybe it was something much more intimate. And when you see it clearly, it will be difficult to keep living exactly as you did before. Maybe the greatest distraction in your life is not on your phone. Maybe it is the need to know what everyone thinks, the need to respond, to predict, to explain, to control, to receive some external confirmation that you are doing the right thing. And if that is true, simply turning off notifications will not be enough. You need to reclaim what you quietly handed over to the world, authority over your attention, because attention is not merely where you look. Attention is life. Whatever repeatedly receives your attention begins, little by little, to occupy your inner world. So do not finish this video simply thinking, I need to be quieter. Let's turn everything we have seen into 3 actions you can start today. 1. Create a gap between what happens and your response. The first action is simple. Do not immediately respond to everything that triggers a strong emotion in you. When you receive a message that irritates you, wait. When you hear criticism, breathe. When someone says something unfair, do not allow the first 10 seconds to decide the next 10 days. Why does this work? Because an impulsive reaction tries to relieve the emotion immediately. You feel angry and want to respond. You feel rejected and want to demand an explanation. You feel insecure and want to explain yourself. But when you create a pause, you recover something fundamental: choice. It is in this space that Stoic discipline meets biblical wisdom. You do not control what someone says, but you can work on your response. And being slow to speak does not mean weakness. It means not allowing another person, through provocation, to choose who you will become in that moment. How can you apply this today? Adopt a simple rule. Whenever something triggers an intense emotion, ask yourself before responding, is what I'm about to do going to solve the problem or merely soothe my ego? Sometimes you will need to speak. Speak. Set the boundary. But do it after the emotion is no longer holding the steering wheel. Sometimes you will need to establish a boundary. 2. Protect what does not yet need to be exposed. Choose one important thing you are building, a change, a project, a discipline, a decision, and try not to immediately turn it into an announcement. Work on it, pray about it, observe your motives, build evidence through your actions. Why does this work? Because there is an enormous difference between receiving satisfaction from talking about a change and receiving satisfaction from living that change. Maybe you don't need to tell people you're going to wake up earlier. Wake up. You don't need to convince everyone that you are disciplined now. Practice discipline. You don't need to keep explaining that you are changing. Change, and let time reveal what your words cannot yet prove. How can you apply this? For the next 7 days, choose one personal goal and drastically reduce the number of people you talk to about it. If you need guidance, seek someone wise. If you need accountability, choose someone trustworthy. But do not turn something sacred to your growth into a public presentation. There is strength in building where no one is applauding. 3. Every day, separate what is your responsibility from what needs to be surrendered. This may be the most important practice. Take a sheet of paper, mentally divide it into 2 parts. On one side, what is mine to do? On the other, what is not under my control? On the first side, you might have apologize, work, study, take care of your body, set boundaries, keep a promise, make that phone call, change a behavior. On the second, the other person's response, the perfect outcome, the past, what people will think of you, what will happen 6 months from now, the guarantee that nothing will go wrong. Now do what is on the first side and pray about what is on the second. Why does this work? Because you stop using worry as a substitute for action. And you also stop using action as an attempt to control what only God knows. Stoicism offers an extremely useful question. What depends on me? The Christian faith adds another. After doing what is mine to do, can I trust God with what is not mine to control? That combination produces a different kind of strength, not the strength of someone who believes they control life, but the strength of someone who has learned to remain steady, even when life does not obey their plans. And now, I want to ask you to do something different. Do nothing else for a few seconds. Just think. Think about how many times you lost an entire night because of a conversation that had already ended. How many times you tried to convince someone of who you were. How many decisions you postponed because you were waiting for approval. How many plans you announced and abandoned. How many times you opened your phone looking for distraction because you did not want to be alone with your own thoughts. How many times you called something worry when deep down it was an attempt to control the future. And think about how many times you prayed for peace while continuing to hold on to the very thing you claimed to have placed in God's hands. Maybe some things are beginning to make sense now. Maybe you were not lacking strength. You were distributing your strength to too many places. You were not necessarily lacking direction. You were listening to too many voices. You did not need to respond better to everyone. Maybe you needed to understand that some responses never needed to be given. And maybe God was not demanding that you figure out how to control the next chapter. Maybe He was teaching you to be faithful in this one. This is the reflection I would like to remain with you after this video ends. How much of your life have you lost trying to manage things that were never yours to control? Do not answer quickly. Look at your relationships, at your worries, at what you post, at what you are trying to prove, at the people whose approval still determines your mood, and especially at that situation that occupies your mind when everything else becomes quiet. Ask, does this require action from me? Or surrender? Because now you know the difference, and once you recognize that difference, continuing to repeat the same pattern becomes a conscious choice. You do not need to leave this video as a completely different person. You simply need to act differently the next time. At the next provocation, pause. The next time you feel the urge to over-explain, stay silent for a few seconds. With your next goal, work before announcing it. With your next worry, ask what truly depends on you. And when you reach the limit of what your hands can carry, surrender it. Not because you gave up, but because you finally understood that faith is not controlling the outcome while asking God for help. Faith is also doing what is yours to do and trusting Him with what never was. Here is your challenge. For the next 7 days, protect your attention. Start each morning with a few minutes without your phone. Choose one goal to work on quietly. And at least once a day, write down one worry and ask, my responsibility or God's control? Then act on the first and pray about the second. See what happens to your mind. Do not seek perfection. Simply notice how much energy begins to return when you stop giving it away to everything that demands your attention. And now I want to leave you with a question, and I want you to answer it honestly. If no one could praise, validate, or even discover what you are building, would you still choose the same life you are trying to build today? Maybe your answer will reveal more about your choices than any advice in this video. And if you made it this far, write only this sentence in the comments: I do my part and surrender the rest. Not as a beautiful phrase, as a commitment. And I will know that you stayed until the end and understood exactly where your true responsibility lies. If you prefer, also tell us which city or country you are listening to this message from. It is extraordinary to realize how many different places can be reached by the same reflection and how many hearts are facing such similar battles. And if this video helped you see something that was quietly stealing your peace, like the video, that may help this message reach someone who is also trying to control what they can no longer carry. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring with us this meeting point between Stoic wisdom and the Christian faith, between learning to govern your own mind and learning to trust God when our ability to govern reaches its limit. Marcus Aurelius reminds us of our responsibility over our minds. Epictetus reminds us of the boundary between what depends on us and what does not. Scripture leads us beyond that boundary, because you do not need to control everything to walk in peace. You need to discern what is yours to do, have the courage to do it, and the humility to surrender the rest. So when this video ends, do not immediately return to the noise. Remain silent for a few seconds. Maybe there is something you have been trying to control for months. A person, an answer, an outcome, a fear, a future that has not even arrived yet. You have already thought about it, already imagined it, already tried to predict it. Maybe you have already done everything within your reach. Then ask yourself one last time, why am I still carrying what I should have already surrendered? Maybe that was the secret from the beginning. Silence is not only for hiding your plans, it is for finally hearing what the noise would not allow you to notice. You do not need to give your peace to every provocation. You do not need to give your energy to every opinion. You do not need to give your identity to people's approval. And you do not need to carry in your own hands what belongs to God. Do your part. Protect your peace. Work in silence. And trust God with the rest.